Scarlet. Yeah. Speaker. I think this is working, but my levels are seem low. I wonder what'll happen if I do a little bit of this. Testing, 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 testing. It's getting bigger. I think it's getting bigger. Either I'm that or I'm talking louder. I can't tell. How do I sound? Okay. Is it a little loud? Yeah. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
No, it's like.
Okay, good. Now I'm gonna go start video and see what it looks like.
They're having me on Business Radio X in a couple weeks.
Really?
I'm like, I'm just waiting for her to find out that I'm a total joke, but it hasn't happened yet. I'm like waiting for her to revoke the invite.
You might think you're a joke, but nobody else does, Mariah.
That's just because I haven't done it good enough, probably.
It's called imposter syndrome, and I have it too. That's why I listen crazy. That's why I always try to encourage you because
That's why I love that Neil Gaiman speech that I saw that video of, the commencement speech, because he talks about like how whenever you're like a creative and you have success, you're just like waiting to find out like what's wrong.
Yeah.
Because there's no something must be wrong if it seems like it's going right. Like,
Yeah. Or also if you do things that are really good, you're like stoked and everything, but then someone acts a funny way, you're like, I wonder if they found out about me.
right.
That I'm not as good as
You're
that
just waiting.
they thought I was.
Yep.
Yeah, totally. Imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
Classic case. Okay. Who can share only host? Okay. Huh. Cool. Right on. The host and sharing out. I want to share. All right. Tell me how that looks. What do you see? Oh, you see the Zoom thing probably. What I want you to see is that. Can you see the creative brief? Are you in the?
No, I'm joining. Sorry,
Oh.
I'm still on the Max 6.
Get in. Join. So far, I'm all lonely. Well, there's like 5 minutes till it starts. I'm gonna have some Chick-fil-A.
Why is it making me register?
You are already registered.
Wish I had access to Resound's Instagram, because then I could like be behind the scenes on our Instagram stories. Like, although I probably shouldn't be. I probably shouldn't.
You're gonna do a resound takeover for your photography. So I'm gonna start going through this out loud. Just so, are you in yet? Are you logged in?
I'm in.
Weird. It doesn't even show you. Doesn't show me that you are here. Oh, participants too. Okay, but it doesn't show me your picture or anything.
I'm not the person who registered, right?
Mariah Sautel.
Is there a separate person than me?
Mm-hmm. Two other people registered.
Hopefully they show up.
Yeah, one of them's. I told you one of them's one of my former students, right?
Oh.
She already learned about the creative brief, so I'm like, what are you doing here? It's awesome though. Acacia, I remember. The students always think I don't remember them. I'm like, totally remember you, especially the ones in my smaller classes.
I've always wondered if professors remember students.
I'm like, not only do I remember you, but I really like you. You know?
Did you ever have students that you didn't like though?
Yep.
I feel it.
Yeah.
It's not
Wow.
hard to find them.
Yeah. All right. So if you're, I should do it like school. Like if you're in the class for a creative brief, focus your content with creative brief. You're in the right place. If not, go ahead and leave. You know, at the very first day of class, if you're in the class for History 101,
Yep.
you're in the right place. If not, go ahead and take off. And then like three or four students would just like grab their stuff and like take off. Shoot, I'm in the wrong place. I think I even did that once.
I've never done that. I've been waiting for it to happen. It just never happened.
Dude, I want you to be mic'd too next time because it's fun chatting. This is what Mike and I do. Like we chat a little bit and just we crack wise a little bit and then get into our content. So we started the AZ Brandcast. Okay, anyway, if you're here for the creative brief, focus your content, you're in the right place. Let's talk about, do some intros. I'm Chris. I'm the manager of operations at Resound, and I love creative briefs. That's not a problem. I can quit whenever I want. Okay, so what we'll talk about is, first of all, we'll talk about why we're here. Why does the brief matter? And then what makes up the brief? We'll talk about how to generate a working hypothesis and then gathering content for your brief. And then the fact that brand also matters when we're doing all this stuff. And that agenda is old. I didn't actually update it, but I'm going to go with it. Here's one of my favorite quotes. Pursue one great decisive aim with force and determination. It's a quote about concentrating your forces and your efforts so that what you concentrate on matters. But why the brief? See, that's the big question for everybody. Why would we worry about a brief? I'm looking at my notes. So the thing is, you're spending money on creative. And the creative brief focus is it makes it count. It's about concentration of efforts. Gives you clarity for delegating. It gives you objectivity for strategy and creative evaluation, and it gives you simplicity. Going through those one by one, clarity for delegating is it gives you the ability to delegate, and it gives you a nice test for whether you have something that you can delegate or not. It gives you objectivity and strategy and creative evaluation. First of all, for strategy, because it helps you know that what you're asking to be done is actually going to meet your business's strategy. And then it lets you evaluate creative, because with a good creative brief, you know exactly what was supposed to be accomplished with the creative. And so you as the manager can actually look at the creative and say, okay, yeah, that's what was accomplished there. Or you can critique it strategically and not just through taste, right? Not just like I like it or I don't like it, but you actually can critique it strategically to make sure that it was doing what it was supposed to be doing. And then finally, simplicity to get most out of your creative focus. Creatives need focus. They need you to tell them exactly what they're supposed to accomplish in simple terms. You don't have to close the door on their creativity, but you need to help them understand what their creative is going to help you do as a company. And there are a couple of ways that a brief, you don't have the brief, how that shows itself, and you can actually see a lack of a brief in the creative. It'll show itself up in the creative. So if the product isn't described in a way that resonates with the client, the user, the end user, you'll be able to see that in the creative, and the brief will be able to tell you that. But if you see that lack of resonance, you might need to go back and say, hey, who do you think we're talking to? Who are we selling to, right? And if you can't tell the creative, you can't give them that answer, or you haven't given them that answer, maybe that's why the creative isn't on focus. Another thing is we don't know the audience well enough to apply the product to their life. In other words, we haven't done the persona. We haven't done a believable persona. We haven't done that research work that helps us know who we're talking to, and therefore how should we be talking to them? How does it fit their life? Why does it matter to them? And then finally, the last most obvious way it shows up in creative is that your argument isn't compelling because you can't accurately define why the heck they would care about what you're offering them, or you leave the creatives to guess. And you don't want the creatives to be doing strategy work. They might be great strategists, but that's your job. And if you're not answering that question, then you can't expect them to. So let's get into it. At this point, I'm feeling pretty good about things. So I'm going to stop role playing and wait for people to show up.
Is it 12:30?
Yeah, I'm going to give it 2 more minutes. I'm just going to go from the top. Is it okay if I talk to you since you're here? It'll help me.
It's totally fine. I'll hear most of what you're saying.
Actually, Mariah, this is kind of good for you, because if you can just be like, next time I give you an incomplete assignment, you can just be like, hey, could I have this information? And I'll be like, what? You don't need that information. You know how I always do. And then you just be like, but you said that I needed to have this. You're breaking your own rule, you hypocrite.
Where's my 1 page?
Yeah, where's my 1-page brief? Yo.
Where are my 3 essential parts? I read your article.
Nice.
Well, I had to say, told you I proofread it for you.
That's true. You're well familiar with this topic. All right. Let's blaze through this. All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Creative Brief Focus Your Content with the Creative Brief Talk webinar. If you're interested in that, you're in the right place. First of all, I'm Chris Stadler, and I care about the Creative Brief a lot. It's my favorite. And I used to teach this kind of thing. And I've been a creative, a copywriter, and so I got really frustrated when people didn't have a creative brief and then expected me to write copy. I felt like I was being asked to read minds. So once I got into college, I started thinking about strategy a lot, and it kind of made me someone who I became a big advocate of the creative brief. So what are we going to go over today? The agenda is this. First, we're going to talk about the creative brief, why it matters, because that's important. If we don't understand why it matters, we're not going to care about the rest of this. So we're going to talk about what makes up the creative brief. We're going to talk about a working hypothesis and how the working hypothesis helps guide our research and guide our brief. Whether we want to go from, brief first and then go do the research, or whether we want to do research to the brief. And then gathering content, and then we'll talk about how brand matters. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that, so Clausewitz, he wrote on war, and war is a great kind of purifying petri dish for strategy, because the end of war matters. It's a little bit like in business, we can talk about strategy, but in war, it's kind of like, they won, right? And so we know that they had a strategy. Clausewitz understands strategy pretty well. It's one of the main books on war and strategy in the canon. He says, pursue one great decisive aim with force and determination. And what we're doing with the creative brief and with any kind of strategy is we're saying, hey, here's what really matters the most. And a coherent strategy is going to be based on really what's our main goal of life, what's our main goal in business, therefore what's our main goal in marketing, therefore what's our main goal with creative, therefore what's our main goal with this campaign, and therefore what's our main goal with this piece, right? So it should be a coherent, consistent hierarchy where everything is working together toward one great goal. And so why does this matter so much? Well, here's the thing. You're spending money on creative, right? I mean, creative costs money. It's not something that it's not free. And every time you send something back for another revision, or because the copywriter didn't get it, every time you do that, you're spending more money. You're using up more man hours, and that's important. The creative brief focuses it to make it count. So the creative brief basically, it tells you, it gives you the key pieces of information without a bunch of noise that helps you to understand exactly what the campaign is about, what the piece needs to be about, what it needs to accomplish. And that arms the creatives with great ability, not just to know what I'm being asked to do, right? But it also creates a solution space for them, and a space where they can play and they can show their genius. And is basically what you're telling them is, hey, you can do a lot of stuff. You can do a lot of different things that I can't even imagine right now as the account planner or as the, whoever's asking you to do this creative work. But I want to open up this for you, and so that you can understand, hey, as long as you achieve this goal, right? This think, feel, do goal, right? As long as you can create something that's going to make people think, feel a certain way so that they take a certain action, you have accomplished your goal. So now do it however you want. And good creatives will take that and just say, okay, this is awesome. They may not know where to start, but at least you've closed up the solution space to where they know exactly where they can play. All right, so my 3 points, though, are it gives you clarity for delegating. It helps you understand that what you're asking people to do actually will matter. It matters it matters to your strategy, right? You'll notice it, and if you write up the creative brief and it's not consistent with your strategy, you're going to notice. The second thing is it gives you objectivity, and that objectivity applies 2 ways. It's for strategy and creative evaluation. It's for strategy in that it helps you to understand that it helps you to test your brief, what you're asking them to do, against the campaign strategy, but then it also helps you to evaluate their creative. And that's really important for you because you have to hold creatives accountable, even though you may not be a creative director, right? You may not be someone who knows how to push creative by itself, but you may know how to push the creative toward a better strategy, right? You may be able to look at the words and say, that's not accomplishing the strategy we said we wanted to accomplish. So it gives you the ability, maybe not as an art director or creative director, but it gives you the ability as a strategist to test the creative. And then finally, it gives you simplicity to get the most out of your creative focus. Like I just said, it gives the creatives a solution space to play in. Okay, there are a couple of things I might add to this slide that basically, how does it show up in creative? Because if you don't have a creative brief, here are the things that you're likely to see. There are a bunch of things, but here are 3. The product isn't described in a way that resonates with the audience. And if you say, hey, creative, you're not expressing this in a way that they'll understand, the question for you is, well, then if you knew that, then why haven't you told the creatives? The creative brief helps you not to make that mistake. It never puts you in a position where you knew a bunch of stuff that was relevant to the creative, but you just didn't tell the creative. It basically catalogs that for you. It checks your list, checks your boxes, and then allows you to share that with the creative in an organized way. The second thing, how it shows up in the creative, is that if the creative just doesn't look like it speaks to the audience, it doesn't understand their life, or it's irrelevant, or it's using words that are maybe millennial words, but it's aimed at 50-something men, then that's how it's going to show up in the work. And what a shame that you're going to delegate creative incompletely and then get the creatives to spend all this time and work and then get it back, and then something as simple as you didn't get the audience right. They didn't understand the audience. Really, it's not just demographics, it's psychographics. It's, how do they think about the product? What's their problem, right? You're likely to have a demographic that has very specific psychographic that has an even more specific use case for the product or service. And so now you're spending more money sending that back to the creative and then asking them to create a new version. All right, so the last one about how it shows up in creative is the argument isn't compelling because you can't accurately define why the audience would care about what you're offering, or you're just leaving the creative to guess at what the strategy should be. How is the creative supposed to know what the strategy should be? You're the one who is assigning the task. Unless you're asking your creative to be a strategist and do a bunch of research, you need to give them that. Okay, so so I think we've established there's a real cost to not giving all the information that they need, right? Not doing a creative brief. Okay, so let's talk about the creative brief. You know, it's hard. Nobody wants to write a creative brief at first, but it's a way to discipline your process, and it's a way to get more predictable results. And I'm just warning you that the following truths are going to challenge you, but they'll challenge you in the same way that exercise does, that good exercise does. In other words, you'll be sore, but it'll be a good sore. Okay, so first off, the creative brief is one story. It's one story about your audience, their use case, what is it, who's it for, and why does it matter to them? And there are a couple other components too, but it's one story. It's not two stories. It's not, you know, it's quality, service, and price, right? It's not three stories, right? The reason someone's going to care about price is vastly different than the reason they're going to care about quality, whatever quality means to them. And so if you have more than one thing to offer them, you have more than one brief, and you should be doing more than one campaign, because it blunts the story. If you don't keep it one story, it blunts the story, because now they don't know which story they're hearing. And people only ever really understand story. Okay, it's also one page, and I've seen a lot of briefs that were more than one page. But the reason it needs to be one page is, I think we all know Albert Einstein's quote, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And this is a great example of that. If you're using many words, you may, without knowing it, be handing off something to the creatives that you don't completely understand yet. And I've had that happen so many times where, why is my phone ringing? Is that me? That's annoying. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Again. That needs to get turned off for next time. Well, it's only you and me. So anyhow, so it's not poetry. It's not a great work of art you're trying to create. Don't try to be clever. Be blunt. This is a business assignment, and we need to keep the brief very brief. And so here's what happens when you don't write a brief that's only one page. Here's what happens when you don't keep it simple. Is your creatives read the brief and they feel responsible for all the words, even the ones they don't understand. So if you haven't kept it brief and you've added qualifiers like you know, you might say, you know, the audience is this, but then yet they're also this, right? Or something that's a contradiction, or that adds irrelevant detail, or detail that's just not completely necessary, then you haven't written it well enough. Probably because you haven't settled in on your philosophy of exactly what you're trying to say. You don't understand, right? And so what happens is they don't ask about everything because they think they might understand, right? They think, well, I think I might get it. And what if they don't? And what if you're writing those things for a reason, but you haven't made it clear enough? If it's simple, they're going to ask about every little detail, and that's what you want. If it's complicated, they're going to be like, yeah, I kind of get it. So that's the problem. If it's concise enough that everyone thinks each word is important, then they will ask. So make them depend on a set of words, on a very simple, small, brief, concise set of words on one page to understand the assignment. And this puts you in control. It doesn't take control away from you. Yeah, it adds accountability, but it puts you more in control because every word matters. Okay, now let's get to the good stuff. So what are the three main questions the brief is supposed to answer? And if you're not clear about these things, your creatives won't know where to focus their efforts. Your creative options will end up being all over the place, and it'll probably be shallow, right? You might have some really shallow concepts that come through, or really obvious, or things that are already been done, right? And so 3 questions that'll really focus your brief. So what is it? Okay, so think of the product. What about your product is the most compelling to your audience and their greatest felt need? This might get you into use cases. Like, why do they want to know? Like, why do they want this information? What would they want to know about our product? Think about tax planning, right? What does 18-year-old budding entrepreneur want to know about tax planning versus a retired engineer from Boeing, right? So the tax software is basically, you could just say, oh yeah, it's tax software. It helps you do your taxes. And that's great, but you're not going to be competitive. So what you want to do is say, okay, well, for the 18-year-old entrepreneur, here's what you need to know. And then when you buy your media, you choose your Facebook demographics or whatever to make your ad spend. Now you're writing creative that is directly to that person, what they care about and how it matters to them. So an example, and I stole this from a brief that I did for Cannondale. So it's been 4 years since the release of the original Cannondale Synapse, a high-performance endurance bike designed to deliver race-level performance. The new Synapse is an evolution of the former with a balance of performance and comfort with a clean design. The Synapse campaign, True Endurance Machinery, will organize all tactics leading with a visual storytelling approach, campaign materials below. So first of all, I was involved in this brief, so I take part of the blame. But if you notice here, it talks about a few different things, right? It's been 4 years since the release of the original Cannondale Synapse. I'd cut that. What is the Cannondale Synapse? A high-performance endurance bike designed to deliver race-level performance. Okay, so it's yet another race bike. Is there anything more specific that we could add that would make it really relevant to this audience? Let's see. The new Synapse is an evolution of the former with a balance of performance and comfort with a clean design. So I can tell you from the conversations we had writing this brief that really what they're doing is balancing performance and comfort. And, with a clean design, but really it's about balancing performance and comfort. Now that is something that a creative could maybe latch onto and say, okay, what happens when we don't balance performance and comfort? But the thing is that, did that really come through the brief? Or is it hidden amongst a bunch of other statements about how great the Cannondale Synapse is and about its history? Nobody cares about its history, probably. That's probably not what you want to choose to focus on in an ad. All right. So what's next? All right. So we talked about what is it. Now let's talk about who's it for, right? So who's your audience? Is it someone who makes sense and are knowledgeable? Then tell us about their life, at least enough that we can understand how they need what you're offering. I always like to write creative briefs that make sense to the person who's, to the creatives. Well, that's a requirement. But I want the creative to be able to say, hey, I know this person, right? So if Mariah is designing something for someone, wouldn't it be great if she could know, hey, who exactly am I designing this for? And if I say, oh, it's this person and they're kind of like this and they're kind of quirky and they have a good sense of humor and they like bikes and whatever, she's like, oh, that's like my cousin. That's like my cousin Andy. That is exactly my cousin Andy. So now how relevant is that now going to be when she creates something for Andy? It's not just for a demographic. She's creating for Andy, for this person she knows and cares about and feels like maybe she knows how to talk to him, how, what he'd want to hear, the words he hates, right? And that gives you a way to personalize things. Think about if you've ever written an email to someone and then you wanted to make it look like it was you were writing to each person individually. So you have like 10 people you're writing an email to, right? Has that ever happened, Mariah? Like 10 emails? All right, so you write one and you're like, I'm just going to copy this over. But then you start realizing when you copy it over, oh, I should just change this. Oh, I should just change this too. Oh, that would be weird if I didn't change this, right? Because you know that even though you think in theory it makes sense to write the same message to a bunch of people, it really doesn't. That's not really how we are in life, right? But when you do customize those emails, they become much more interesting, more fun to write because you're writing to a person. All right, so a couple things to watch out for in the who's it for, right? A couple of rookie mistakes. If your brief is too stereotypical, in other words, you're talking about your audience and it's too stereotypical, So I got to work with college students, and a lot of times college students would end up, um, they would end up writing because they have very limited life experience. They're writing to this TV personality, right? They're writing this TV personality. Um, so and so, or their ideal life. I saw this about a gazillion times, right? Oh, she's a 21-year-old New York advertising, creative who does yoga, has a cat, always drinks coffee, and basically the cutest lifestyle you can imagine, right? And hardly anybody's life is that perfect and uninteresting, right? And so if it's too stereotypical, this shows a lack of research. So um, including attributes found in your research into your brief doesn't make it weaker. So you might think that adding this detail, but it might not, this is like saying something bad about the audience, right? No, say something bad, make it interesting, make it someone who has texture and is real. As long as what you're putting in the brief is typical of the broader audience enough to be realistic. So if someone is like, you're talking about the Lululemon or something, if the persona you're thinking of is all this cutesy lifestyle and everything's perfect, and then they, but then they have this like ratty old car and they're a Satan worshiper. Well, like, are all of them Satan worshipers? Are a lot of them Satan worshipers? Well, if they aren't, then maybe that's something you pull from the brief. And that's an extreme example, but you see that a lot. And so if they're too stereotypical, then that might not be believable to the creatives. It may not be someone that they know. So the second point is that they're too demographically based. So we talked about demographics, psychographics, you're drilling down into this segment and you start with demographics, but demographics are really the language of media. They're not necessarily what you would give to a creative and say, that's enough for you to know about the audience, because writing to a demographic is very difficult. Designing to a demographic, extremely difficult. Writing to a person not so much. And so that's the second, is too demographically based. And then finally, there's too ideal. And basically, if you want to know too ideal, just go to the Hallmark Channel and look at the perfect lives of the characters. Does your target audience own a bakery that's clean and cozy but never charges anyone for anything? That might be too perfect. It might be too stereotypical and a little unrealistic. All right, let's pick on Cannondale a little more. Okay, so who's our audience? Former elite amateur level racer or Grand Fondo rider who enjoys group rides and pushing their physical limits. Values a bike that's fast and versatile, able to tackle different climbs, descents, and road surfaces, rides solo occasionally, but really motivated by small group rides with 3 to 4 friends. And then it talks about reaching we're focusing on the core target because we believe this will allow us to reach the weekend warrior volume target along with it. By the way, that's kind of a useful thing to point out. You can focus on a core target like professionals, because that if it's an industry where the weekend warriors pick up on what the professionals do, that can be a really good strategy. But let's ignore that for now. That's really more of an explanation. So former elite amateur level racer or Grand Fondo rider who enjoys group rides and pushing their physical limits. So to me, I'm looking at this as a writer, putting my writer goggles on. First of all, always be suspicious of an or an and in a creative brief, because that makes it seem like you haven't decided. And as a strategist, it's your job to decide, not the creative's job. But I think this might be the same type of person right here. And so I'm okay with that, but who enjoys group rides and pushing their physical limits. All right. So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, which is it? Is it group rides or is it pushing physical limits? Right? Because those are two different use cases. And I want to know how to frame this bike in a way that hyper focuses on one of those. If it's or, then now I have to write an ad that's one level abstracted. And now I can only say, I can't create a concept that strongly ties to one or the other of those. I can only talk about both, and now I can't tie it together with a strong concept. Very difficult. Values a bike that's fast and versatile, able to tackle different climbs, descents, and road surfaces. Well, that makes me feel like they're really trying to push their physical limits, which is awesome. Ride solo occasionally, but really motivated by small group rides with 3 to 4 friends. All right, but that pushes me back into the group rides. And so I think this is 2 briefs trying to be forced into one. I think they didn't think this through when they created the campaign and set aside budget for that. And so to me, that's 2 briefs. Okay, so we talked about what it is, who's it for, and now let's talk about why it matters to them. So here's where we connect the need with the product. If your audience is the hero, right? You're not the hero, the product's not the hero, the audience is the hero. Then what does your product do to help them live better, perform better, whatever? Well, how does your product help them? So make sure to be honest with yourself. This is a chance to be honest with yourself. And this is where a lot of disconnect comes out and becomes obvious. Because in the end, if it doesn't resonate with the audience, and if it doesn't resonate with the creatives, because the creatives will be able to see this, and the creative will be weak because of that, then you probably need to rewrite or go back to research. So be a good judge, and you're going to save yourself a lot of time in this step. So let's look at what Cannondale did. Do you like how I say what Cannondale did instead of what I did, even though I wrote the brief? Yeah, you're noticing that? Okay, awesome. Yeah, makes me feel better. Direction A and direction B. So first of all, don't have a direction A and a direction B in a creative brief. There's one direction. The creatives, what you're asking the creatives to figure that out. So you can let me say that you can involve the creatives in the process of creating the brief if you really want an outside, an extra point of view. But in some cases, but once you write the brief, don't leave it up to them to decide. It's just not where they live, right? So direction A, out of all the competition, Synapse is the most versatile bike, comfortable enough for all day rides, yet with performance and weight of an elite racing bike. So to me, I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, so what is balance, is versatile? Versatility is almost a commodity, right? I mean, a versatility claim is a commodity claim, and that's kind of a weak claim. But let's look at direction B. Out of all the competition, Synapse is the most accessible bike. Accessible. So that makes me feel like, okay, so it's for brand new riders. But they just said it's not for brand new riders. So I'm seeing a contradiction. And there may be a way, we could say, oh, well, here's what they mean. Okay, but that's not what they said, right? In the brief, if it's not literally true, it's just not true, right? And so that's my problem with how Cannondale wrote this brief. Okay. All right, so let's look at some supporting aspects. So there's the single most important thought, and then there's the proof. So sometimes, all the time, you need a single most important thought. Some people call it the single most compelling idea. The single most important thought or single most compelling idea summarizes summarizes the brief interestingly and briefly. And this is essential because essentially every time I would look at a creative brief, the first place my eyes go is the single most compelling idea. And then I go methodically through the brief and test each section against that and make sure it's consistent and coherent. And so it requires a little bit of philosophy on your part to be able to say, okay, that's a logical contradiction. And you have to be able to have a high sensitivity to those logical contradictions in the brief. But a key question, all those things, what is it, who's it for, and why does it matter? Do those things, can you summarize all those things in a simple sentence? So my example, my good example, and I'll show you the Cannondale example, but my good example is the audience should buy Red Bull because it will help them to do better on their exam, even if they didn't study. So we know who the audience is, right? It's probably dudes, because dudes study less. I'm stereotyping, but we'll talk about stereotyping and testing assumptions later. It's people who basically are a little bit irresponsible, but it's like all of a sudden when it happens, when it hits, they care about it. So they're willing to like slam a Red Bull. And so all of a sudden we understand kind of who we're talking to. And then as we read the rest of the brief, we're going to start to have that unpacked. Like when we talk about the audience, we're going to see, oh, it's dudes who are in college and they're between this age and this age. And, they ultimately care about their grades, but right. So you're going to go through all this stuff. So, and so now the creatives can make a campaign that connects Red Bull to maybe that time before the exam. And this also helps too when you're doing media planning, because it's like, well, how would you might even go into product placement, right? It might even go to they're coming from, they slept in, they're coming from off campus, and they have to go by the duck store, and so the duck store needs to have, during finals, they need to have a Red Bull table out front that's giving away free Red Bulls or something, right? Or like they did at the business school at Oregon, where they would walk around and hand you like a Red Bull or something, and to get you to try it. So that's the single most important thought. The proof is why they should believe the claim. So there are some creative briefs where people are going to say, well, wait a second. That Cannondale bike, it can't do all it claims to be, because that's physically or scientifically impossible. And so you might have, why should they believe the claim? That might be introduced into that brief to basically help the audience know, oh, they discovered this new way to make the bike, a half a pound, total, right? And, normally you think that's impossible, but here's why it's possible, right? So this section isn't always important. You may not have to prove a claim. If that's the case, then just leave it out. They might not be important. All right, so for the Synapse, the single most important idea is Synapse is the bike for cyclists rewarded by challenging riding experiences. So this is getting a little better because it's not just talking about the Synapse, which most of the other stuff we've seen has done. Most of it's talked about the Synapse, like the Synapse is the hero. This finally actually ties it into the rider. So what I don't love about it is it doesn't go deep enough. Challenging riding experiences, I think it can go deeper. If we understood the audience, it might go deeper into, well, what makes it challenging and why do I want to be challenged, right? Is it because I want to feel like a badass, or is it because I want to, I fancy myself, great racer, because I want to pass people up on the road? Those are all different motivations. There's keeping up with the Joneses. There's, personal, satisfaction. Maybe I just, I want to feel like a badass and nobody ever has to see me. Another one is like, no, people have to see me pass them, right? So there are a lot of different potential motivations that can be packed up and implied within this. But we won't know what they are unless we really know the audience. And I don't think they've done a great job of saying that. All right. So, and then for the proof, why should we believe the claim we just talked about? Here's what we had in the brief: performance, lighter, stiffer, and faster. Comfort, the smoothest road bike Cannondale's ever made. Again, it's two things. And as a copywriter, I'm going to have a very difficult time coming up with one really compelling, argument, like a story or a concept, that ties all these things together, because there's no one concept that ties these things together strongly. I mean, you could just say like, all right, well, what's light, stiff, fast, plus comfortable? Maybe an analogy would be a car, some kind of car, or I don't know, but it's just like a weak analogy. Compare a bike to a car. That's ridiculous. That's not going to be compelling. So I felt like this one was a little weak, and would have been made much stronger if there was one direction that we were taking the brief. And then the brief, the research could have gone into one of those things rather than have been scattered over two competing claims. All right, so getting closer to the end here, we're going to talk about questioning the brief. How do you question the brief? So here's where you find your research questions. Now we're getting into how you build the brief just a little tiny bit. So, all right, so look at, let's look at the Cannondale brief. Does your audience care? So let's look at the single most important thought in here, and let's say, how does that help us? The single most important idea from this Cannondale brief, how does that help us create research questions? Well, what I would do is if I saw that brief, I would say, okay, the Synapse is the bike for cyclists rewarded by challenging riding experiences. I would say, how do we know, right? How do we know that these are they're rewarded by challenging riding experiences? Because comfort is one of the possible benefits of this. So I would say, okay, well, who's our audience? And now let's go talk to them and let's ask them to rank let's say the 5 most important parts of their riding experience, right? Like what are the 5 most important attributes of a bike that they care about that are different between bikes? And so if you have that list of 5 and you include performance, and you were clear about what you meant by performance, and then you included comfort in there, I think that would be very enlightening. In one example, there's a Super Bowl ad for WeatherTech floor mats and cars. This ad talked about how they're made in America. Well, I happen to know the agency who worked on Husky Liners, which is their direct competitor. Husky Liners the agency, they did some research and they talked with these truck owners, right? They actually talked with the people. They did their research and they found out that they ranked, top 10 most important attributes about your truck liner. And they put made in America as one of them, right? Made in the USA. They assumed that WeatherTech, since they were spending so much money on Super Bowl ads, they assumed that WeatherTech knew that made in the USA was super important to this audience. What they found, though, after they did this research, is they found that it didn't even rank in the top 5. It was number 6. Made in the USA was not super important to people. And so this is a great example of using your claims, using your creative brief, and then questioning it and saying, look, why do we know that? Why do we think that? Right? And then prioritizing your research questions based on that. Okay. So, and there are 2 ways to really approach this. What we just talked about right now was the brief and then the research. But if you were if you were one of my students at the University of Oregon, you would have in campaigns, you would have heard me tell you don't start with a brief. You start with a situation analysis. You then find a target audience to recommend, and then you work on the brief. And so there are 2 ways to go about this. From the brief to the research. So what you do is you write your working hypothesis. If you're working from the brief to research, essentially this is like a bootstrap method, right? Small business, you want to write a brief, you want your creative to be clever, you want it to be focused, but you don't want to do a bunch of research right off the bat. So what you do is you go from your gut, you trust your instincts, and you write your working hypothesis with all your naive prejudice in there, right? Like, I just think this type of person in my experience would, buy this type of thing for this kind of reason, and they're jerks, and so this is what they care about, or I idolize them, and so this is what they care about. Just write it all out, right? Paint a picture from your mind. And then, and so the reason I say do it all, right? Do it up. Put in all your prejudices, right? The reason I say to do that is because it's going to be so much more interesting if it's harder to add texture and interest to an audience member. It's easier to subtract it when you find out it's not true. And so put it all out there. And then the next thing you want to do is test it logically against, with other people. And so show the brief to somebody else. Say, hey, does this make sense to you? And they'll be like, I think you watch too much TV. This is not the real person, right? This is nobody I know is like this. And then they let them mark it up and just say, okay, can you be more specific, and let them question pieces of it. You're going to find out that, okay, well, maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. This becomes a research question, right? Maybe I thought that they did X, and this other person's saying, no, they never do X. And so you're saying, okay, well, how do we find out if X is true with this audience or not? And then finally, the last thing you do is you generate the research questions based on those disagreements. Talk with people, find internal consistencies with the brief. So make sure you're not writing just the audience, you're writing the whole thing. What it is, who's it for, why does it matter, single most important thought, and then proof. Why should they believe the claim? And then make sure all that stuff is really coherent and logically sound. And once you do that, you're going to have a couple of research questions. If you don't, your brief probably isn't very interesting, and your competition probably knows the answers just like you do. Okay, so the other way to do it is go from the research to the brief. So, and how you do this is you do a SWOT analysis for the product. In other words, you do a SWOT analysis for a company. We'll do that same thing for the product, and just say, hey, you might even do it for the marketing if there's existing marketing. Say, okay, the SWOT analysis, the strengths of our marketing or the product, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats. Write those out. It's a great way to get a good kind of view of what your product is and give you some research questions. What you do is you take the opportunities of the SWOT analysis and you turn that into an audience, and you say, okay, well, what do we need to know about our audience? Write down your questions, write down your assumptions, and then go out and find your audience. You might have 3 segments, which you will then prioritize by importance, and then you'll make a campaign to that top audience. The next thing you do is you create personas. Once again, it's very important that we know exactly who we're talking to, how they think, and what the kind of language they speak in. Finally, you'll create the brief, and the persona will be in the brief. Okay, so what do you do next? What are the next steps? Well, develop your working hypothesis, write the brief, write it rough, test it, run it by others, see if it rings true, research, fill in the gaps, write the brief, and then remember that the creatives are always right. And I don't say this because I started as a creative. I only say that because if they don't understand the brief, then the brief is wrong and it needs to be rewritten. Okay, the last part is this is just a little reminder, and because this is what we do at Resound, and I don't want to move through, I don't want to just breeze over this part about your brand. The issue is we can do the creative brief, we can create all kinds of content, we can fill our blog with really interesting, helpful tidbits that really help people out. But if they don't see you as the one who's the expert, if they just see it as a list of good content, but they don't see you as the ones who they trust, then it's not always going to matter, right? They might just go to somebody else. They might say, wow, that's a great place for content. You might be able to sell like through affiliates, sell some stuff, but they may never really appreciate who you are. And so it's really important to understand that. At Resound, we build brands that people trust. And so you don't just want people to see you giving good advice. You want them to think you're the only one who gets it and that they can trust you to solve their problem. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, we have our brand workshops. And I think, Mariah, is there a way to chat that through the link to Services Brand Development? Sweet. Should have asked you that beforehand. But yeah, if you're interested in that, check us out, get in touch, reach out, Other than that, thank you. And please let me know if you have any questions. And I think there would be a place for questions in the chat, right? But I don't think anybody's joined us. So let's see. No open questions in the QA. But all right, for everybody who's joined us, thanks for joining, and we'll talk to you next time.